So can I start? Can we start? Okay, thank you, Jamie. So I would like to welcome all panelists here today. My name is Marta. I'm going to be the facilitator for this panel. It means I'll ask you questions and everything. So I would like, I would like that when I ask you a question, if you feel that you like, for example, when you hear the answer of someone else's question, if you feel like you want to add something to the discussion, feel free to do so. We are trying to keep the conversation going and be as and swap as many ideas as possible. So yes, feel free to add as much insight as you want. I would now like for each speaker to introduce themselves very briefly, say where you're from, and anything that you like, really, just so that we all get to know each other. So Aryan, you could go first.
Hello, everyone. I think I will be audible. So my name is Aryan, and I'm an undergrad student from Tata Institute of Social Sciences, pursuing bachelor's. And it's really nice to be a part of this panel discussion. And I'm really excited to let's just get started.
Amazing. We're excited to have you here. Karen?
Hi, everyone. I'm Karen. I'm based in Canada, and I volunteer with the Parmozy Foundation. My background is in health, and my interest is in health, human health and environmental health. So this is really, really a great opportunity for me to be part of.
Amazing. Stella? Hello.
I'm here. Hi, guys. Hi, everyone. My name is Stella Nyambura Mbau. I'm from Nairobi, Kenya, and I have an interest in climate resilience. So this is also really good for me. Yeah, I think so. This will be exciting.
Amazing. Good to have you here, Stella. David? Hello, David.
Hi, everyone. I hope everyone is able to see me.
Yes, we can see you.
All right, thank you. My name is David Watson Mwabila III. I'm from Zambia. My major interest is in climate finance and building resilience among rural livelihoods. So thank you.
Thank you. Julian or Julian, I apologize if I mispronounced.
I think it's fine. You can pronounce it however you want. My name is Julian. I'm one of Denmark's youth delegates to the United Nations for Climate and Environment. That means that I officially represent the voices of youth of Denmark in the Climate Convention, as well as the Biodiversity Convention. And as well, I'm the European and Nordic coordinator of the Global Youth Biodiversity Network, which is the major group for youth within the Biodiversity Convention. I'm originally from Argentina, and I grew up in Spain, but right now I'm living in Denmark.
Wow, that's quite the journey. Okay, Rain Rain.
Sorry, which Rain?
Rain Patrick.
All right. So hi, I'm Rain, a climate reality leader trained in July 2020, so just recently, and I'm also one of the youth climate strike organizers here in the Philippines. And I'm also currently taking up BS physical therapy, so I'm still a student. Okay.
Amazing. And I think that's it. So now that everyone has introduced themselves.
Oh, Marta, I think there's also one more.
Who?
Oh, okay. Ate Bea.
Hmm?
How about Rain Taswico?
Excuse me?
I thought there
right,
would be
so
one
is there anyone who hasn't introduced themselves? No, okay, awesome. I will now start asking each of you questions. There are some questions that have been pre-prepared, and there's also questions that are coming in on Pigeonhole from the audience. So yes, I would like to start with Aryan. So Aryan, in your speech, you said governments have ignored migration happening as a result of the climate crisis. Please explain what climate migration means and some examples of specific causes. And to what extent do you think government inaction on these links to hostilities we often see towards refugees and migrants moving for other reasons?
So climate migration is a very complex issue. Rather than being the sole factor, it is many times a push factor, because for people who have already been living in like poor economic conditions, they don't have enough resilience, they don't have the adaptive capacity, and they become vulnerable to climate-induced disasters. Now, this will be divided into two parts. One is the sudden events such as cyclones, floods, earthquakes, and then there are some things like desertification, rising temperatures, which affect their livelihood. Now, this has been affected by the government in the fact that they generally see this as a state sector. They think about only international migration, which is like migration happening across borders. And this prevents them to understand the internal migration which is happening within their country. They always think about protecting the state resources, and they ignore the whole concept, which has also led in the fact that there is no accepted definition when it comes to climate migrants in the international law. And this has this has resulted in a lack of statistics, lack of data regarding such a kind of migrants. And to be honest, there are around millions of migrants all over the world which have been affected by climate-induced disasters. We don't have a data that is because of, and that is because the governments have not actually led and made initiatives to like accept these migrants as real. So that's pretty much it.
Thank you very much. So Karen, we appreciate that you're filling in for Abigail today. And so Abigail, in her speech, said something about MAPS, the Marine Arctic Peace Sanctuary, could affect almost every UN Sustainable Development Goal. Please, could you explain more about this and how this could happen?
Yeah, absolutely. MAPS, the Marine Arctic Peace Sanctuary, is extremely relevant and rapidly advances multiple SDGs all at once. So if you look at the SDGs, 17 of them, number 1 to 8 address humanitarian and social issues to protect people's lives, such as eradicating hunger, poverty, access to clean water, and creating opportunities for more decent work. And so these SDGs are about protecting human life and dignity, and that's exactly what MAPS does. So MAPS is protecting the entire Arctic Ocean from damaging activities that will damage the sea ice, which is our planet's natural air conditioning system. And by doing so, MAPS keeps our global climate stable, and it mitigates extreme weather events that result in food and water shortages and unstable societies and climate refugees. And especially in light of this year, this is particularly relevant. So MAPS protects the Arctic sea ice and also keeps the surrounding region cool, so it prevents the thawing of the Arctic permafrost, which is actually keeping bacteria, viruses from being released into the environment. And so it's protecting us from future pandemics. Now, furthermore, SDG 7 is about reliable access to sustainable energy, and MAPS prohibits Arctic oil and gas exploration. So it actually accelerates our shift to renewable energies. And if you look further down the list, SDG 11 to 15 is about promoting sustainability and ecological harmony to protect nature. And MAPS is the most direct and effective way to cool our overheated planet by protecting its own natural cooling system, which is the Arctic ice cap. And SDG 14 is about protecting oceans. MAPS is the largest marine protected area in the world, and it protects thousands of species that are unique to the Arctic Ocean. And finally, I think. Yes, SDG 10, 16, and 17 are about promoting peace and partnership amongst nations. We know that militarization of the Arctic Ocean is a real threat, and MAPS is necessary to defend against that. It brings together our global community to protect the Arctic Ocean for the good of all humankind, because we're all interconnected.
Indeed, we are. Thank you so much, Karen. So before we go on, I would like to remind everyone in the audience to ask questions on Pigeonhole. You can find the link in the YouTube live chat. Thank you so much. And once again, remember you can engage with other speakers. And if you feel like you have to add something, please do so. We're all here to discuss and to share our views. Thank you so much. So now, Stella, you suggested disaster management needing to be more participatory to include women and other underrepresented groups. What does a better process look like to you?
I think you're referring to my recommendations. A better process would look like disaster risk governance. So I'll make reference to that, which is how different entities, public, private, individual, coordinate at different levels to reduce risk. So you can think of it as a participatory approach to risk reduction. There are some basics to good governance of anything, really. It must be participatory, transparent, equitable, inclusive. And to achieve this, this disaster risk governance, it should mirror, it should be representative of the people it serves. So women, the youth, and the other marginalized groups of people should be included, having the say in decision-making. So in the public, private, individual entities, they should be represented, as well as in the different levels of coordination, national, subnational, regional, they should be represented. Also making reference to the most vulnerable people, which is usually these groups of people. Somehow ubiquitously, they're left out of conversations that would make the biggest difference to them. Anyway, when we talk about them and the need to adapt to increase their resilience, then this is exactly how you can definitely start here, having their needs heard, which hopefully then means their needs are addressed. The national adaptation plans make provision for the same participatory approach to be used. Yeah.
All right, thank you so much, Stella, for your input. David, living in an affected area so badly by climate change, what do you think is the role of the developed nations and how can they help countries like yours? Can David hear me? Can you hear me, David?
Yes, I can get you. Thank you for the question.
Should I repeat it?
No, I was able to get you. I was just working on my Zoom. Thank you so much. One of the biggest challenges that developing nations are facing, not only in sub-Saharan Africa, but in the global South generally, is the issue of climate financing. Most of them do not have the capacity to fund the various climate initiatives that the countries need to undertake in order for us, as well as the rest of the world, to slowly transition into a green economy. So when we start looking at the dynamics of climate financing, it is very imperative that developed countries, such as the G7, come on board and assist the least developing countries. One of the means in which these countries can do this is one, ensuring that the various climate financing mechanisms that have been developed by the local countries themselves are youth-driven. In most cases, for example, donor aid has been usually focused on government to government. In cases where these countries are rooted in corruption, it becomes extremely difficult to really yield the desired results. As such, there has been a lot of gaps in terms of ensuring that the various intervention mechanisms that have been developed both locally and abroad are not able to reach the intended targets. So these countries, when they come on board, one is that they should be able to ensure that not only are they able to assist financially, but they're also helping least developed countries develop various mechanisms that benefit the grassroots. The second part is having intergovernmental dialogues. One key problem that has hindered development, especially in sub-Saharan Africa, is the idea that you can be able to develop a policy in Germany and just transit it into Zimbabwe and to work. We've seen it through the structural adjustment programs and so on and so forth, that does not work. So one key component that developed countries need to do, other than supporting the least developed countries with financial means, is that they need to bring in their expertise, sit down with the local decision makers, and work together on how best can they address the climate challenge that the various countries are facing. This will ensure that the solutions are local focused, local driven, and really incorporate the various local dynamics in specific countries.
Thank you so much for your speech. We will now move on to Julian. So in your speech, you had 3 main points. You talked about education and research. You talked about education institutions and how they need to be more sustainable. And you also talked about engaging local communities. Now, how do you think it is the best way to engage and educate each other?
Yeah, I think that's a good question.
Hold on,
before starting with that,
we hear you.
You cannot hear me. All right. What about now? Can you hear me?
Say something. Is this better?
But
say
not
something.
good. Can you hear me if I talk like this?
Yes. Okay.
All right. If it sounds bad, let me know later, and then I'll just fix it while others are talking. But before, I wanted to start supporting what David was mentioning within the concept of sort of cooperation between countries and economic support to youth-driven solutions. I think that's something actually we have been advocating a lot within, like youth has been advocating a lot in Denmark on ensuring that part of the cooperation and support finances actually go to youth-driven activities, and they are like promoting partnerships between young people, because actually those solutions that can be provided by young people are, and in many cases, actually better than what can be created by normal development funding. So that's something I would like as well to talk a little bit more later on if there is space for that. But you're asking how do we engage and educate each other better. I think the primary responsible on ensuring that people is well educated, that they know enough about the climate crisis, and then they engage democratically on these discussions is the governments. That our school system should be providing these tools to young people to engage in the discussion and knowledge. But that's not necessarily the case, what is happening right now. And in the meanwhile, until that actually happens, we need to do it ourselves. And I think we are doing it at the grassroots level. I think like a lot of the youth-driven movements are educating our other young people, and they are sort of promoting that there is knowledge, and they're promoting engagement. I think youth-driven civil society has had a very important role in this, and that's really important. And I think we need to keep doing that, but we also need to be smart in the way that we do it. We need to do it in an inclusive way. We need to do it in a way that we understand the diversity of the differences of contexts. We need to ensure that we engage and educate, reaching as far as possible, not only within maybe just people living in cities or the most privileged backgrounds. And we need to do it in a way that is also free of shame. Shaming other people doesn't usually help to get them into the fight, but we need to do it in a way that is constructive and ensure that more people come in. And while we do that, we need to keep fighting for ensuring that actually governments implement this knowledge and these tools within the education system, because we need to create long-term solutions where actually people are educated on climate change and as well are taught how they can engage within the democratic debate to make a difference in their society, and not only taught that if they turn off the light a little bit more at home, then that would be better for the planet, because that's not the only solution.
Thank you so much, Julian. You have made some wonderful points in your speech. Rain is not right now here. He said he will come back.
Hello.
No, not you, the other Rain. And so we will go back to Aryan. So Aryan, what do you think about what Julian said?
I think it's really important, what Julian said. This is because even when it comes to climate migration, there's a lack of research. There's a lack of understanding the point of view from the side of vulnerable communities. Often, what happens is that the research focuses on the solutions made by the Western society, or mostly from the global North, and they undermine this local solution, which are actually much more effective. And education is important because it should focus on different backgrounds, and it should focus on it should not focus on just a common solution produced by global North, but it should implicate different solutions for different sections of society. So I really think what Julian said is really important and should be brought about in climate education, especially.
Okay, thank you so much. Now, Rain, if you could answer the following question. At the start of your video, you talked about some corporations historically reframing the discussion about the climate crisis to encourage less meaningful actions. How can we make sure the same doesn't happen again?
All right, so before answering that question, I would give a little background for those who were not able to attend the talk. So big corporations have the money or resources to mislead the public by employing their own team of scientists and researchers that will produce biased documents that will be in favor of the company. And they also often use fallacies when arguing. One example is the fallacy of false dilemma, wherein you are either in favor of maintaining livelihoods or in favor of renewable energy. But in reality, both can coexist. So this is why we must go to more credible sources of scientific information and protocols, which are more often than not peer-reviewed journals such as the Lancet, as well as intergovernmental bodies such as the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change, or the IPCC. Now, again, another thing big corporations do is lobbying to legislators to go against pieces of legislation in favor of cleaner alternatives. So how do we combat this? It's simple. We lobby back. Reach out to government officials. If they don't listen, exert greater pressure. Hold them accountable for enacting policies that are not science-based and not serving the interest of the people, of their constituents. And lastly, and another thing, we can maximize the internet to educate others and to lobby and discuss with key individuals. We can use the internet to reach out to more youth and build a stronger, urgent collective climate action. And lastly, to emphasize, since the corporations are reframing the discussion, we must also reframe it in our own lens, in our own perspective. So we need to reframe the climate crisis as not just a scientific problem, rather a human rights issue. And talking about the human rights, the Philippine Commission on Human Rights is in the final process of the national inquiry on climate change to see how we can hold big corporations legally and morally liable for contributing to the climate crisis, which can violate or threaten human rights. So these are just some of the things we can do to combat the misinformation corporations are employing. Thank you.
Thank you so much. Karen, do you have anything to add to that?
No, I think Rain really hit, the nail on the head, in the sense that as youth, we don't necessarily have the same resources as big corporations, but social media has really become a level ground for youth to really, assert their voice, and in a way that's quite democratic. So I think that's a really good point, and I think I think it really reflects what the sort of movements have been about that we've seen, in recent months and years.
Okay, thank you so much. So Stella, you explained the need for coastal and agricultural adaptations, particularly in some of the areas worst affected by climate change. How can those in less affected areas, such as many richer countries in the global north, understand these issues better? So how can we in the global north empathize with people in the global south?
Yeah, I'm going to start with, it's a Swahili saying, but you'll understand as I go along. Ukimwona mwenzako amenyolewa, wewe tia chako maji. So I remember something that Dr. Lucy Jones said. It's sort of paraphrasing the same thing. So we don't have to suffer directly ourselves to be empowered to act, quote unquote. It's good to understand that this is global, which means it's probably a matter of time before the climate events, the risks, or all of these stuff that's unfolding come knocking on your door. If it hasn't happened already, it's on its way. I'd also say activism helps. I think Karen mentioned it's very raw, it's very present, persistent, and firm. Activists, mostly the youth, have changed the landscape quite a lot. Not only by creating awareness, but also by communicating how climate change is already unfolding. And this is very important when people see and feel how others are suffering. There's others who are using their agency to take big corporations and countries even to court, which is very inspiring. So I'd say activists have a chance of getting across to these people. I'd also say empathy, which again is something close to something Julian mentioned. I'll lean into something Maya Angelou said again about being human, that these people, their actions, their thoughts are human, and therefore we should be able to relate. We should be able to see ourselves in them, including climate deniers, sadly. I believe empathy would allow us to put ourselves in their shoes. And I feel if we were able to do that, we'd start to maybe understand what they don't understand. The point is some common ground and work from there. Now, if we were talking about a case where a big corp was setting up a coal plant, I'd say, yeah, go after them. So what I mean referring to empathy is it requires some situational awareness on our part to know who we're talking to, what opinions are they predisposed to, and what are the implications of their actions, because it would be wiser to go for big fish. It's not that we have that much time to put ourselves in everybody's shoes anyway. Yeah, so I think activism, empathy.
Thank you so much. That was a wonderful speech. Karen and then Aryan, if you would also like to add something, so because I've seen you wrote something in the chat, so please.
Yeah, I really resonated with what Stella was saying. And your question, Martha, about like how do we reconcile sometimes maybe different perspectives between the global north and the global south. And at our organization, Poverty Foundation, we don't really, we don't operate along those divisions or those lines, because our kind of our guiding principle is the whole world, all of life is interconnected. So what happens in the Arctic Ocean You could be in India, or you could be in Asia or Africa, and you might say, well, that's really far away from where I am. But the truth is, what happens in the Arctic Ocean is affecting all other parts of the world, whether it's extreme flooding, droughts, water stress, like all of these things are real issues everywhere. So I think we have to really sort of step back and say, you know, are we really making decisions that are for the benefit of all? And that's really the fundamental principle what MAPS is about. It's about interconnection of all life. So I just, like I said, really wanted to add that to this conversation.
Thank you so much. And Aryan, if you also have anything to add.
I'll again say what I think Rain said, that this issue is seen, like the climate activists see this issue as a humanitarian issue, which is, I think, one of the most important things. Like, I think this is all an illusion that the whole world is divided, and there are different nations and we have to serve policies for the different nations. But the fact is that climate change is something which affects every human being. And our focus should also be right now on the vulnerable communities, because they're actually a majority. There are a lot of people who are getting affected, and there are only a couple of rich people, a very small percentage of the whole population, who have the means to create adaptive capacities for themselves. Hence, we must form our solutions in a way which are meant for all, but right now are focused on the vulnerable communities who are at the forefront of the change.
All right, thank you. And Rain, of course, you can add to Karen's insight, and please do. Please go ahead.
Hello. So Stella mentioned empathy and Karen mentioned interconnectedness twice. And I would just like to point out that the approach to climate crisis is multi-sectoral, and one such sector is the religious sector. And they are vital also in highlighting these values of interconnectedness and empathy. And one of the recent messages of Pope Francis, Laudato Si, actually emphasizes how we as individuals can take care of our common home, and how we are losing sight of what God has given us, of the values important to us, and we must go back, be humble, and go back to our root. So even those who are not preaching any religion, you also have a role, even if you don't have, if you are not that engaged or that frequently going to any of the traditions you're engaging in. It's good also that you can have a role, and you are important in our fight towards achieving climate action. So, regardless if you are religious or not, all of us have a role. And for those who are religious, it's important to go back to our rule, to our role, to our roots, and to our set of beliefs in order to gain inspiration in taking action.
Thank you so much for your insight. It is so true, the fact that we all have a role, and it is everyone's job to do and act as best as they can in order to improve. Improve the situation. So now I would like to ask David a question. David, living in an area affected so badly by climate change, what is your community doing to combat it? And how have you guys managed to do this?
Thank you for the great question. Rephrasing it as what we've managed to do to combat it would be an understatement. Coming from an area and working with communities that are badly affected by climate change, one of the key things which I usually love to highlight is that most agriculture in the global south is rain-fed. And considering the fact that climate change is really changing the dynamics of the rain patterns, communities are not able to grow their food. And as a result, the levels of poverty and hunger have been tremendously increasing. One key issue which we are trying to do is first and foremost, raise awareness Because when the issue of climate change just started, it was an issue of debate whether it's real or not. But when somebody really experiences the effects firsthand, the conversation immediately moves from a debate into something which needs urgent action. So what we are doing in Zambia is that we are mobilizing communities, especially those that are based in rural areas. We first start by sensitizing them on the effects of climate change, how it's not only impacting them, but it's also impacting the dynamics of the country as a whole. When we do that, we try to raise awareness as well on the decision maker side through storytelling in radio campaigns in different local languages. We have a lot of local languages in Zambia. So what we are trying to do is that we are trying to incorporate the language barriers so that even those that are not able to speak English can fully understand what is going on. We use those stories to advocate for more action on combating climate change, both locally and the country as a whole. And we use those stories to amplify the voices of the unheard. And last but not, excuse me, the least is we started an initiative called Project Parmozy, which basically means working together. So the initiative is a sustainable beekeeping initiative where the most rural and vulnerable communities in Zambia are trained on sustainable forest restorations and beekeeping as a means of having sustainable sources of incomes to tree logging and charcoal production. So those two are really what have highlighted our work on the ground to really improve the lives of communities. Thank you.
Thank you. We will now move on to Julian. Do you have anything to add to that, Julian?
I think what you mentioned, David, is really important on the way of how we can engage those communities that are already seeing the effects of climate change. I mean, there are many that are talking, well, climate change is the thing that is going to happen in the future, but in reality, it's a problem that is happening in the present and is affecting people that very differently, and unfortunately, it's affecting some people much more than other people. And I think that also connects maybe a little bit with the previous question on how do we get as well the global north to understand these things that are happening. And that's, I mean, I'm coming from a global north country. I mean, I'm working in a global north country. And that's a question that we ask ourselves a lot. Like, how can we show people what climate change means and what it represents? That is not only that it's going to get a little bit warmer in Denmark and that we're going to have a little bit less rain in Denmark, but actually that puts at stake the lives of people in the global south mainly. We have been working a lot with the concept of radical honesty, where we're actually trying to tell people what climate change means. We're not trying to sugarcoat it. We're just saying not controlling climate change means that people will die. And it's a humanitarian issue, and it's something we should all take responsibilities on. And I think what David is commenting right now on sort of engaging those populations at the local level, it's something that is extremely important to amplify their voices. And it's something that I was also talking a little bit in my speech about engaging local communities. How can we ensure that actually schools take up their role? Schools are, as I mentioned, are not only institutions where people go to learn and where people are taught things, but are also social. They play an important community role that other institutions do not really play. So how do we use that community role to amplify these voices, to organize people, to engage people in the democratical debate? And this should not only be kids, should all be like the entire communities that should be engaged in this, turning schools into democratic centers to promote a green and fair transition is something that I think is very key and is really reflected on what David was mentioning.
Thank you so much. And now that you've touched the area of climate education in schools, what age should schools start teaching climate education? Is it ever too early? And how can they do this? This is a question that came on Pigeonhole.
So it's when and how? From what age?
Yes, when and
right?
how.
Yes. Well, I think climate education should be sort of environmental education should be involved, should be included at all levels of the education system. Of course, there is like a common sense, like a common sense line where someone is too young to sort of start learning about those things. But I think even when someone is too young, you can start also having other aspects that have to do with environment as well, sort of like a more value-based education, where you talk a little bit about what is the role that nature have on human beings' life, and in our sort of everyday life. But I think it's something that we should strive as much as possible to have through the entire education system. Now, how to do it? I think that's a local decision. I think we need to listen to teachers on this. I think, as I mentioned, teachers, together with students, are everyday experts of the education system. And as someone was mentioning, I don't remember who, I think it was Aryan, that he mentioned, we cannot implement education solutions from the top down, where we just have one solution fits all, but it's something that we need to do, taking in consideration the local realities. So I think we need to listen to teachers, and we need to listen to students on how do they consider that this can be done in the best possible way. But I do believe we should strive towards having environmental education included at all levels of the educational system. So it should be a vertical inclusion, but it should also be a horizontal inclusion. We should not only have one subject called environmental education and that's it. We need to see how actually climate and biodiversity relates to all the other relevant subjects that we have in school. And how does the ecosystem impacts our societies and the different subjects that we have. And that's something we need to become a little bit smarter on, because right now we have understood a lot, like, at least within the modern way of understanding the world, that was promoted a lot by the global north, where you have people here and nature here. So we need to understand how our education system should also see, and how the realities of our society, how the different things we're learning as well relate to our ecosystem, and how the ecosystem relates to that as well. So it needs to be a vertical and a horizontal involvement.
Thank you so much. David asked to add something to Julio's statement, and then Rain, you will have the floor to also provide some insights. So David, please go ahead.
All right, thank you so much. I just wanted to bring one thing into everyone's attention, is the political dynamics between the North and the Global South. Usually, for lack of better terms, I want to be as blunt as possible. The Global South is the most affected part of the world as a result of climate change, yet they contributed the least. So when you go on a policy discussion, for example, at the United Nations, countries from the global north, because they haven't yet started feeling the effects of climate change, the conversation is a little bit different. So I just wanted to highlight that in the various education systems that the various countries want to develop, which must include environmental issues, some of these discussions need to be brought into perspective. So both the global north and the global south need to understand that they are part of one ecosystem. And they also need to understand that it is imperative for them to work together if we are going to fix this mess. So that's one thing I just wanted to bring into everyone's perspective. Thank you.
Thank you. And now, Rain, I saw in the chat that you had mentioned something, so you have the floor, please.
All right, so I would like to thank Julian for mentioning the horizontal education, and that there should be just no one specific subject tackling climate crisis, and it should be integrated in various subjects. And I would like to highlight the importance of this mindset when engaging or having education that is on health or the medical schools for doctors or health professionals, especially since there are already a lot of reports showing the connection between health and climate crisis impacts. And David also mentioned earlier that the about the global north and the negotiations. Um, Talking about his earlier point on amplifying the stories of the unheard in promoting climate justice, let's say that the unheard right now are the countries from the global south, especially let's say the Philippines. The Philippines was recently ravaged by at least 4 storms, 4 typhoons in a span of at least 3 weeks, and yet there's not much international coverage showing the impacts of these typhoons, of the phenomenon aggravated by the climate crisis. Now, we are developing countries, and we are, as stated by David, contributing less than developed countries to the climate crisis, and yet we are hit hard and we are more vulnerable to various impacts. And this can actually now be a call to the global north countries, to the leadership, to the incoming COP26 presidency of the Great Britain, that we, of the United Kingdom, that we must have a voice, that our concerns must be amplified at an international fora, so that our struggles as a people, our struggles in the country are highlighted, and that they will have a imperative to act upon it, to provide social equity in addressing the climate crisis.
Thank you. And so I believe you also mentioned this in your speech, but of course, our mental health is affected as well. And so regarding this impact, this on our health, mental health, how can we improve our mental resilience and well-being in the face of such crises? So how do we remain strong? And how do we avoid getting too anxious about certain things related to the climate crisis?
So yeah, actually there's a growing this not really a disease yet, but a condition as of now, the eco anxiety. And there are a lot of steps that we can take. But I cannot tell you what to do, but I could at least guide you to some extent. So the most important thing is to find healthy coping mechanisms that is suitable for us. So if you love playing games, then play games. If you want to watch movies, then watch movies. So relax. Don't give too much of yourself in whatever you are doing, your work. In occupational therapy, actually, find an occupational balance between work, leisure, and self care. And also, in the physical therapy perspective, do physical activities. Yes, it sounds that there is a disconnect. We're talking about mental health, but we're now talking about physical activity. So, there are a lot of research actually showing the correlation between exercise and mental health benefits. And lastly, I'm guessing a lot of us here are activists or are community organizers. So don't lose hope for a brighter and greener future. There are a growing number of decision makers in many sectors of society that want to take climate action. This was actually apparent here in the Philippines, wherein the local government officials, some of them are really saying this is because of the climate crisis and a lack of policy and disaster risk reduction management policies. So, talking about anxiety, like, oh no, the climate crisis is intensifying. Getting, it's now getting a toll on us. Yes, we are now experiencing greater effects of the climate crisis, but we can still take action. Our idealism can be turned into a reality. It just needs time to lay out stronger foundations towards a just transition that is holistic and more inclusive to many people. So our anxiety that it's not reachable, the ideal state of having lessened impacts of climate crisis is not reachable, that's untrue. We have the capacity, we have the ability to make that into reality in our time.
Thank you so much. I believe Karen wanted to add something to this. So Karen, please.
Yes, and I echo some of what Rain was saying, and I also want to add to it in a sense that there is a lot of anxiety. I think especially this year with COVID, just basically changing everything. There's, anxiety, there's stress, but I think it comes down to, for me, that we need to remember that we each have the power of choice. we each have the ability and the power to choose with the decisions that we make, whether we are supporting the greater good, you know, based on the truth that we're all connected, that we're all interconnected, that we can make decisions for the greater good, or we can make decisions that are based on, you know, selfish interests. So I think that's really key, because I think if people remember that, it really emphasizes that sense of agency, that we each have that power to make a difference. And also at Parvati Foundation, we also really believe that, you know, as much as traditional activism, you know, some of the things that, well, many of the things that people have mentioned on this panel, they're really important, but we really, you know, with the crisis that we face in the world today, we need to be doing something really large scale, ambitious, and urgently. So what we have been doing at Parvati Foundation is we have created something called the Global Education for Maps, which is basically music, video, apps, anime, you know, TV, magazine, books, and stuff. And that's because these are the vehicles that really people respond to through their hearts and their minds. So we can't just be, you know, sort of wagging our finger at people and saying, well, you got to do this, you got to change that. I think it's, you know, really much more effective to inspire people through their hearts to remember that we're all connected, and doing that through, you know, things like music and art, which are often the universal language that humans all around the world respond to, can really be an effective mechanism for bringing about the change that we need. So that's what we're working on in order to make maps a reality.
Amazing, thank you so much. So now, Aryan, in your speech, you talked about illegal mining happening in some parts of India. Please, could you expand a little bit more on this, explain to us how this is happening and the impact it has, and how it's affecting climate change and our planet?
So illegal mining is happening almost in a lot of parts of India, especially the central and the coastal regions. And the biggest impact which it is leading to is the process of desertification, which does not, like, the impacts of desertification do not limit itself to India, but also spread to other countries, especially to Pakistan and to Bangladesh side. Desertification is covering more than, I think, a quarter of India. And since the population of South Asia is still on the rise, so this will be impacted by two things. First, the people will be migrating to the urban centers, which will increase the pressure on the resources of the land, such as water and such as even land for living. And another thing, it is resulting in the displacement of tribal and vulnerable communities. For example, according to a report, 87,000 Indians have been displaced in the span of 40 years, and 1 out of 6 Indians of those are belonging to the tribal or the vulnerable communities. And this is not being done by just the private companies. Even the laws produced by the Indian government are like pushing the tribals away from their own land where they are used to live. And this is a process which has been happening since the colonial periods. Moreover, it is not just the mining of the minerals, but also such as sand mining or maybe removing the land for agriculture purposes. So there are a variety of reasons, and this is actually resulting in a multitude of problems. And again, the vulnerable communities or the minority sections, these are the ones who are impacted the most.
Thank you so much. And also remembering the statement, let us try to remember the statement, everything we do affects all life. This is something that Abigail mentioned in her speech. So Karen, what do you think Abigail meant by this, and how can you link it to the mining that Aryan was talking about?
Yeah, so I would totally agree with Abigail's statement. And you know, the way I think about it is every decision I make, whether it involves what clothing I purchase, whether I drive or I walk or who I vote for, all of these so-called personal decisions have a ripple effect in the larger society. So for example, if I choose to support a fair trade business, it has impacts on the supply chain and the workers who are employed by that business. Or if I choose to support an organization that's protecting the environment, it might help to encourage other people to do the same and ultimately restore natural resources for our generation and for those to come. And I think even deeper than that, the choices that I make every single day, moment to moment, you know, from something as simple as whether I have show a smile for a stranger on the bus that I don't know, because I don't really know what personal struggles that they may be facing, or whether I choose to spend my day being angry or agitated or being calm and present, they all have a ripple effect, whether I see it or not. So for me, every decision matters, not just to me and to those whom I'm most directly related to, but to many other people that I've never even met. And for us at Parvati Foundation, we feel that this is really the only way forward. And I think, as Aryan was saying, you know, in terms of the illegal mining that's happening in India, I mean, I certainly, I don't know a lot about the issue, but I would gather that, you know, the decision is based on not the long-term good for all people. And it's really based on, I think, short-sighted decisions for a select few. So I would really, again, emphasize that those decisions have a ripple effect, whether you're immediately affected, whether you know it or not, immediately affected by this illegal mining activity.
Thank you so much. And now I believe Julian wanted to comment on this.
Yes, thank you so much. And I'm sorry I've been spamming the chat with mistaken like comments that were for about David's work and not to like to share with everyone. But I'm not so good at using Zoom, so I made that I made that mistake. No, I wanted to comment on a little bit on this discussion within about individual responsibility, because I do agree that, as I said, we vote with our credit cards, our consumption does have an impact on in the world. And as well, I do agree that we do have a moral responsibility of consuming in a more sustainable way. But I also think we need to be careful to not over individualize the responsibilities when it comes to climate change. I think we were talking about mental health, and I think one of the reasons why actually our generation has anxiety on this is not only the fact that the world is going in a direction that is quite dangerous, but it's also the fact that many are feeling that they're not doing enough, and they're feeling continuously that they are that their everyday behavior is not sustainable enough. And it does make sense that it's not sustainable enough for many, because the structures of our society are not sustainable per se. Even if I would try to live as sustainable as I can, I still wouldn't be living a sustainable lifestyle, because the social structures and the economic system within which I live are not sustainable enough. And I think we need to put emphasis on the fact that we can only solve this climate crisis through structural solutions that are taking of all of us together as a community and a society. And simply purchasing greener is not going to be enough to make a difference. I think we need to remember that the majority of polluters are not necessarily everyday citizens, but are big companies. And I think that the way of actually, putting an end to this crisis is by pursuing community social structural solutions over individual ones. Otherwise, we risk to put too much pressure on individuals and forget about the bigger picture.
Thank you so much. I believe Rain wanted to also provide insight on this. So you have the floor, Rain.
Actually, that's one of the framing big corporations want. It's the fault of the consumers. It's the fault of those who are taking individual action. They are the cause behind the climate crisis. And as what Julian said, it puts the pressure on us. So that's why we need to emphasize the need of restructuring the system. Let's see, for example, there are people who are engaging in veganism, but the current setup in their community does not allow veganism to thrive without having you, as a consumer, give much resources. So it's expensive. So that's why people who are engaging in veganism do doubt do doubt themselves that they are engaging in veganism, but they don't have the capacity, and now they are suffering from mental illness, that they are not doing enough. They are further contributing to the climate crisis, when in fact the root of the problem is systemic, and that's what we need to address, the systemic issues.
Thank you so much. Stella, would it be okay to ask you a question from Pigeonhole right now? Or, yeah, okay. So how do rural dwellers manage mental health issues associated with climate change loss and damages? And how can they, solve those mental health issues? So rural people living in rural areas.
Yeah, I think it's devastating. I think it's a mental issue challenge. For them, it's a physical loss. It's a lot of losses and damages for them, and these are people who don't have many assets, so they're losing literally everything they have. There's loss of life, and I think in my presentation I mentioned they depend on human resource to farm for them to be able to eat. So if somebody gets ill again, that's a risk to food security. So what they do to cope with this, I think increasing resilience would help. Increasing resilience, climate action, adaptation, that would increase the resilience, the social self-resilience as well, to deal with these situations. Because when you're better able to deal with something, you're at a better place to manage it. When you have more information that you're dealing with as well, reduces vulnerability because you know what to do when. Yeah, so I think it's best to implement the climate smart technologies, the climate smart farming and all of that, and they'll be better able to deal with whatever comes their way.
Thank you so much. And speaking of rural areas, David, how can we implement climate and health education in rural communities that have little or no access to sound educational systems because they are most vulnerable?
I think that's the hardest question I've ever been asked. For one simple reason, it's very difficult for anyone to really measure, like what Stella was saying. It's really difficult to really measure the damage that climate change has, not only on the physical status of the various rural communities, but also on their mental health. One key area which my team and we've used to advocate to governments, not only in Zambia, but in the global south, including the United Nations as well, is that interventions need to be data-driven. You can't just sit in an office and then dream up a policy and decide to take it to the ground. It's not going to work. So the best way to really approach this is, one, to take a holistic view and a holistic approach and ensure that whatever steps that you are going to take must be data-driven and data-informed. The biggest issue which rural communities really have been facing, not only this time that people are paying attention to climate change, but even before that, is that they were on the receiving end of whatever interventions were being designed, be it in Zambia, be it in Africa, be it any parts of the world, India or the Philippines, it's all the same. They've been on the receiving end of any policy intervention. What we are trying to do is really change the conversation now. Let them be the ones to decide what is it that they really want. Let them be the ones to come up with the best solutions that they feel really fits their needs.
Thank you so much for your input, Stella. So in your speech, you mentioned agroecology as a solution for better soils and farming livelihoods. Please explain more about this agroecology thing and why is it important for these areas that you mentioned?
So agriculture and sorry, come again. Please ask that question again.
Yeah. So in your speech, you mentioned agroecology, right?
Yeah.
And you said it is a solution for better soils and farming livelihoods. So could you explain more about this, expand on what agroecology is and why is it important for rural areas and for soils?
Well, agroecology in itself, I prefer to speak to juxtapose this conversation against industrial farming, because that's where you really get agroecology and what it has to offer. Industrial farming relies heavily on machinery, and you could argue it is subsidized by fossil fuels. So without fossil fuels, it wouldn't be as efficient at that scale. It also relies heavily on pesticides to control pests and weeds. Pesticides also have a link to fossil fuels. They're made from petrochemicals, but as more of the chemicals are used, the soils become toxic. This isn't good for the environment and the microorganisms that make for healthy soils. And these chemicals are not only harmful to soil, but when it rains, they wash away into our water sources, our drinking water. So basically what you have, there is a pollutant that's bad for health, that's unleashed into the environment. And research shows that this scale of operations does not really mean more food production. So you end up using more toxins only to produce less food. So agroecology is a move away from this. You can think of it as agriculture that's inspired by natural ecosystems. It means focusing on the health of soils, more soil organic matter, means more food production. It also naturally means less use of pesticides. There are natural alternatives. It means growing native plants, which ensures that there's less of a fuss about them fitting in. You need less irrigation. But this also means that farmers start to value what's in their backyard, which could mean more food variety and food availability. So less crops going extinct. So for vulnerable areas, Sub-Saharan South Asia, where livelihoods and ecosystems are very vulnerable to climate change, and where food security is at high risk, the need for agroecology is an urgent one. Yeah.
Thank you so much. So in a way, agroecology is a climate innovation. So David, how is current climate innovation accessible? And how is it accessible by the people who most need it? So can those who are most affected by the climate crisis, do they have access to climate innovation and to solutions such as agroecology?
Thank you for the wonderful question. I think access is one of the most important thing when we start talking about addressing climate change. In most cases, the people that need the solution the most do not have the access to it. This is partly owed to the system that we are currently operating in. The first thing that we need to do is that we need to rethink on how the various pieces of our society work together. A practical example I will give you is most interventions, especially in the global south, are donor-driven. And when a donor wants to dish out resources, they usually have an intended goal or an intended outcome in their mind. As a result, they basically practice the same old systems of taking an intervention to somewhere where it's not, excuse me, somewhere where it's not really applicable and it cannot work. So one of the things that we need to ensure is that we need to drive down the cost of any intervention that comes into play. The system that Stella is proposing is something which can practically work in the long run. But in the short run, when we look at the current resources, especially in the rural areas and the communities that are largely impacted, it's not something which can work because of the cost that is attached to it. It will be very expensive, for example, for my grandmother in the village to transition from the use of fertilizer to a more sustainable farming system. This is because the government, for instance, in Zambia and countries like Malawi, have financial and input assistance for small-scale farmers. So basically, when an intervention like that comes into play, it means they need to abandon the current system they're working on. And that has a very, very high opportunity cost. So the first thing that we really need to work on is the opportunity trade-off between the current and the proposed intervention. If it's possible, we need to deliberately design a system that puts more pressure on the current system and makes it easy for us to transition into a new system. It's not something which we can do overnight, but I feel it's something which needs to be done progressively, because when we just flip the tables right here and right now, the cost will be too much. So instead of easing the stress on the already stressed communities, we will be increasing it. That is my take on the subject.
Thank you so much. Julian, would you have anything to add to that?
I think it's a very, very interesting discussion. I don't think I have the same level of experience as the previous speakers on the topic, so I wouldn't be brave enough to give my opinion. I think if I may give I think it's called my 5 cents. I think is also true that we need to, whenever we're doing development work, we also need to see what is the social impacts of it. So it's not enough to look at environmental impacts, but there should also be a social balance to see how actually this is doable. We have seen, historically speaking, a lot of development projects that have been done in a way that was quite violent from a policy perspective, and it didn't have a great impact. But on the other side, we're also in the middle of a climate crisis and a biodiversity crisis that requires that we move fast. So finding that balance between the environmental emergency with the social equality mechanisms is something that is really important. And I think it cannot be done without including the local population and their positions and involving them in the decision making. And this is me saying I will not have an opinion on this and then talking for 2 minutes about it. I apologize for that.
No problem. We're here to discuss and to swap insight and everything. So thank you for your contribution. Now, Rain, In your speech, you mentioned the links between higher carbon dioxide emissions and poorer nutrition. Now, what are the causes of this, and what does a better food system look like to you?
All right, so to answer the first question, there is an article by the United Nations Food and Agriculture Organization. It says that plants become less nutritious when grown at higher concentrations of CO2 because they absorb less water and nutrients. Now, crops similar to humans must also be resilient to various impacts, especially those given by the climate crisis. This is why we must employ a better food system. And as what Stella mentioned earlier, agroecology should be one of the principles in developing this system. When I was trained by Al Gore, together with other fellow climate reality leaders, we were introduced to regenerative agriculture, which is a sustainable and organic form of agriculture. It promotes, actually, aside from those benefits from agroecology, it promotes planting diverse set of crops, which is found to be better than planting mono or single crop. Here there is more nutrient-dense soils, as well as it lessens the risk for plant diseases, which increases productivity and helps addressing food security. Now this soil, aside from those benefits, suck in carbon from the atmosphere. So regenerative agriculture does not just promote climate adaptation, but as well as climate mitigation. Now, lastly, slightly touching urban agriculture, it is also an efficient system wherein we utilize urban space to produce crops, which limits the greenhouse gas emissions because of the lessened use of transport vehicles. And this also enhances food security, especially to the rural areas.
Thank you so much. Now, Karen, we have a question on pigeonhole. So this person said that they heard that soils hold a lot of carbon, and they asked what should countries be doing to manage their soils to tackle the climate crisis?
Wow, that's a question that I don't know I can do justice to, but I'll share what my thoughts are. So our project, our initiative MAPS, does not directly impact the soils in a sense that our focus is on protecting the Arctic Ocean. Now, I mean, having said that, of course, if we protect the Arctic Ocean and the sea ice, it basically keeps that area, that region cool, and it does have secondary effects in keeping the permafrost from thawing. And what I can say is that the permafrost, the Arctic permafrost, holds CO2 for sure, but definitely in the form of methane. So I think most of us have heard something about methane being a greenhouse gas that's 80 times more potent than CO2. So it's like a ticking time bomb. And if we allow the permafrost to thaw, it's going to release, catastrophic levels of methane into our atmosphere. That's that really is a bit of a nightmare situation. So I also wanted to point out, in terms of the question about carbon. So our research has shown that by protecting the Arctic Ocean from oil and gas exploration, for example, so not allowing that carbon to come out of the Arctic seabed, we're actually preventing 148 trillion kilograms of CO2. That's a really big number from being released into the atmosphere. So I think we need to look at how significant these sources of carbon are and what it can mean to prevent those from being released simply by protecting the Arctic Ocean. So that's my answer to that question.
Thank you so much for your insight. Now, Aryan, you mentioned the patriarchal culture, trafficking, and discrimination of certain minority religious groups being exacerbated because of the climate crisis. Now, could you please explain a little bit more what you meant by this? And in your mind, are there any solutions that would help tackle these intersecting issues?
So yes, like I said, vulnerable communities are the ones who are facing the effect of climate change the most. Let's talk about the patriarchal culture. So in many South Asian communities, women are seen as someone who we shouldn't take care of much because eventually they will go to some other family as in the form of like they will become part of some other family when they get married. And hence we don't have to take responsibility for that. So when a climate disaster strikes, let's say a cyclone or a flood, so people, in order to reduce the responsibility on their own family, they try to get their daughters who are not even of the legal age, they try to get them married so that their burden will be reduced. And hence this results in child marriage and other forms of domestic violence. Another thing, let's say trafficking. So when a climate disaster strikes, people lose their livelihoods and they are they are in search for jobs. But since and there are individuals who target them, who influence them, they give them promises that you will be given employment, you have to just come with me to a certain place. And hence they are victims for trafficking. Women are usually trafficked into jobs such as sex slaves or even as forced labor. And this happens like almost all over India. There are specific destinations. Now coming on to things like caste problems or even race problems. So, and this is not just in India, this is even happening in the most developed countries such as even United States. I read an article about in the New York Times which said that the colored people who are living in the New York, the urban spaces, those have been developed those have been less developed as compared to the places where the whites have been living since some previous times, and hence the colored people are more vulnerable to the effects of climate change there. Similar things happen in other countries also. The development which happens in the places where the minorities live is not as well as the as development which happens in the places where the upper section is living. And hence this makes them vulnerable. When it comes to solution, again, it can be divided into the solutions which the government can take and which the individual can take. Government is actually not understanding the importance of climate education, which is not given to the communities, which is not given to schools, and they are not even targeting the the socio-political subjects. Like in India, I will give you my personal experience. I was taught about the ozone layer in standard 2. After 10 years, when I reached standard 12, then also I was only and only taught about ozone layer when it came to environment education. This is not the kind of education we need. We need to understand the linkages. We need to understand the science. We need to understand the politics. We need to understand the socio-economical impacts. Only then can we understand what is happening around us. And when it comes to individual, we need to start thinking about we need to start thinking about the perception of other people. Like, what would I experience if I was in his or her place? What would I experience if I was a minority and living in that place? If enough of us to start doing that together, then I think we can achieve balance as a society and human individual.
Thank you so much. Does anyone else want to add anything else to that? No? Okay. Oh, Julio?
I think it's a great point, Aryan, and I think I 100% agree to what you're mentioning. Education plays a key role on it, no doubt about it. And education has a very strong fundamental impact in the long term, right? But that needs to as well be supplemented with legislation and other forms of that, of management, crisis management that can sort of help people in the short term as well. Because as we were saying, and you were also mentioning, like climate change is happening now, and while education plays a key role, we also need short-term solutions. And I think this is very interesting when it comes to a crisis on how they actually sort of underline the existing inequalities that we have. We have seen it now COVID-19 is just like a test round on how our world reacts to a crisis that actually is smaller. It's much smaller than what it is, the climate crisis. And what we have seen seeing is that cases of gender-based violence and in general cases of inequality and oppression has become more remarked than before, because crisis actually strengthen these inequalities. And we cannot stress enough the importance of advocating for social equality while we advocate for environmental programs.
Thank you so much. And so now today we talked about practical solutions, both long-term and short-term, that we can all do in order to solve and tackle the climate crisis. And we also talked about anxiety and mental health issues and how we feel when we think about the climate crisis. And so I would like to ask you, Stella, right now, what has been your personal motivation for getting more involved in the area of climate resilient livelihoods, and what keeps you motivated to keep going and to keep doing what you do?
I think research for me has been a motivation. Sub-Sahara's contribution to carbon emissions is a small share, as David, I think Ray and others have mentioned earlier. So even if it got to zero carbon emissions, it wouldn't make much of a difference on the whole, the global emissions. But also Sub-Sahara is the most vulnerable to climate change, again, as has been mentioned, despite its small carbon footprint. So adaptation, risk reduction, increasing resilience, these should be prioritized over decarbonization. And this is a call to governments, especially, to participate as part of the solution by creating awareness and building resilience. The other thing is inaction by African leaders. That has been a trigger. If developed countries that are more resilient have made climate emergency declarations, then the fact that sub-Saharan countries haven't is a show of poor regional climate governance. So the lack of political will in itself is a great threat. Those two things have been triggers, I would say.
Thank you so much. Now, David, again, amidst this all of this anxiety, all of those mental health issues that come with the climate crisis, what gives you hope and what gives you motivation to keep going? And to keep advocating for this?
There is one old Russian proverb which I like. It basically says, hope is the last to die. So the thing that really gives me hope is opportunities like COP25, where we have various people from all across the globe coming together, to discuss and debate key issues like this. It brings into perspective, and it makes me to realize that the problems that we are facing are not country specific, they are global problems. And in order for us to tackle them, we will require global solutions and global collaborative efforts. And if young people like us can come together, both as the panelists and the people that are watching on the live YouTube channel can come together and say, okay, this is something that we are all going to take action on. This is something that we're going to address. I think, to me, that's a signal of hope that things will get better. It might not be in our lifetime, but we will definitely put up a good roadmap for those that are coming after us.
Thank you so much. Now, Julian, anything else to add to that?
I don't know if what moves me forward keeps me going is hope, but I think it's more the feeling and the knowledge that we don't really have any other solution. I mean, we cannot, independently of whether we're hopeful or not, we need to keep taking this fight, because it's so important. It's threatening our societies at a very, very deep level. Sometimes I might feel more hopeful. Sometimes I might feel a little bit less. But then the responsibility of keep fighting and keep working on this, that never becomes less, because this is probably the most important fight we have had as human beings in our time on Earth. And we cannot stop fighting. It's our generational responsibility, and it's our historical responsibility to keep going. I mean, so they only, I mean, being silent would be being part of the problem. I'm not going to allow that to happen.
Thank you so much. Now, Karen, I believe you wanted to add something, so you have the floor.
Yeah, and I mean, I agree with what everyone has said, that, you know, we have to make that decision to remain hopeful, and seeing all the actions and seeing, you know, how young people are really engaged and you know, lending their voice also brings hope. For me, I also want to add that nature actually gives me great hope, because, you know, we saw that this year with COVID. You know, people stopped flying so much, and they stopped, you know, driving so much. You know, like it took pollution levels down, you know, to historic lows, you know, that we have not seen in probably years or maybe even decades. So for me, I think that's really proof that nature has tremendous regenerative capacity, that we just, you know, I think if we just give nature that chance to allow itself to regenerate, it can do that. And so I think we have to look to that as an example of the hope that we actually have to create a better future in balance with nature. So I think that for me is a really big piece that we can't lose sight of.
Thank you so much. We are trying to solve the climate crisis so that we and nature can continue thriving. Now, Aryan, I believe you also had something to add, so please.
Yeah, so like I heard all of you talk, and like there are different things which motivate each of us. And for me, one of those things is the moral. Like what I believe that what humans as a race, what we have done is like it is not it cannot be justified. Like we have done wrong to our planet, and rather than the fact that the future populations might suffer from our problems, what I find like motivating is that today, like Julian said, that it is happening today. It is not a problem of the future. It is happening in the present, and that has been what is motivating me. Like it is simply not right. The actions we have done are simply not right, and we need to amend those actions. For me, my morals come from a simple animated show. And I think there are even like there might be personal interests, there might be other reasons which motivate people. And hence I would encourage our viewers to find those reasons, to ask yourself why if you like why do you want to work for it. Once you get that answer, it might come to you like in a minute, it might take you like years. But once you find that answer, the actions you take will have much more meaning and will, I think, produce much more results.
Thank you so much. Now, Rain, I believe you also wanted to share something with us. You have the floor.
So I'm going to share the motivators and those that give me hope. So first of all, people who support and fight for the same advocacies. I have my family members, my friends and classmates, and colleagues and fellow climate youth strikers here in the country. It's actually also encouraging to see NGOs and civil society organizations, as well as people from the older generations, to show their solidarity to our initiatives, our campaigns, our calls and demands to the government, to various individuals, to various sectors of society, as well as when we organize the climate strikes in the country. And as I've mentioned earlier on, there are now a increasing number of government officials who also now advocate for climate action and environmental preservation. We now also have influencers, singers, other people who are seen as celebrities in our country who are also now advocating for climate action. Lastly, this panel I am sharing with esteemed resource people from various countries, sharing their various perspectives. We are also the ones who are giving me hope. Hope that we can strive for what can be achieved by our generation. Urgent climate action and lessening climate impacts.
Thank you so much. And now So today we talked about mining, illegal mining, we talked about carbon emissions and issues that have to do with soil and how we can preserve soil and everything. But now, Rain, are there any other issues you think we should be more aware of when it comes to the climate crisis or to our health and well-being?
There are a lot of points that have been shared earlier on, and I would no longer add to that. I would just like to emphasize that the climate crisis is really a human rights issue wherein social inequalities, inequities, and injustices compound on climate change impacts, which leave vulnerable and marginalized communities disproportionately affected. So there is no climate justice without social justice. And I would like to add to climate education, as what was mentioned by many speakers several times throughout the discussions. I think we must also employ other forms of climate education aside from the formal one we receive at school. We can learn more from the communities by engaging with them, and in the process, we are helping amplify their voice. And we can also adopt the principle of community-driven programs and projects, which should be the norm instead of just having the communities be recipients of programs, as emphasized by my fellow esteemed panelists. Now, I'm really sorry if I'm going to deviate from the topic. I would just like to give this time to remind everyone regarding our posture, especially when we attend webinars. So after the presentation of any speaker, or 20 minutes actually, please stand up and also do some stretching, because no matter how good our posture is, maintaining it for a long time can still affect our health in many ways. And also we have the 20-20-20 advice, wherein for every 20 minutes, looking at the screen, we look 20 feet away from us for 20 seconds. And lastly, I've seen Martha do it. Stay hydrated, drink water. So that's all. Thank you.
Thank you so much, and thank you so much for bringing awareness to our physical health as well. Now, I also have another question for Karen. So Karen, Abigail talked about the Arctic Ocean supporting Earth's life ecosystem long before humans were around. To what extent do you think human-centric solution to the global ecological crisis can be useful?
Yeah, I mean, I'm gonna actually start off by saying that I don't think of maps as a human-centric solution, but rather a nature-centric solution, the kind that we have never really tried in earnest. Many of us have forgotten that we're part of nature and that we need to respect the laws of nature in order to live in harmony within the greater fabric of nature. You know, we cannot continue to consume resources blindly at a cost to other species or at a cost to other human lives. And we cannot continue to make decisions that are based on greed and short-term gain at the expense of long-term good. We have been overly human-centric, and that's been the problem. MAPS brings together the global community to protect the Arctic Ocean, not only for the sake of human lives, but for the sake of all life. So it's a win-win for all life, and it affirms the truth that we are and have always been connected with nature. So I really feel that MAPS, rather than focusing on human-centric solutions to this humanitarian and ecological crisis, it's a nature-centric solution that will be a win-win for not just humans, but really all of nature.
Thank you so much. Does anyone else have anything to add to that?
I would like to comment on it if it's possible. I want to fully agree with what Karen mentions on this. And I think it's really important that she's bringing up the concept of nature on this discussion, because we need to remember that the current environmental crisis is not only a climate crisis, we're also in the middle of a biodiversity crisis. And that crisis is at least as important as the climate crisis. It just hasn't gotten maybe as much attention. And even if we solve the climate crisis, even if we stop emitting CO2 and we go full carbon neutral right now, that doesn't mean that we have actually solved the biodiversity crisis, because climate change is not the only driver of biodiversity loss. And biodiversity loss has a huge impact as well on human lives and food security and on our medicines and many other things. So I think it's very important to create that bridge and between climate and biodiversity and understand them as things that we need to take action on both of them together, because they're the two main crises we're in the middle of right now, and both of them need to be tackled with all our efforts.
Thank you so much. Now I saw that David had unmuted his mic earlier. David, would you have anything else to say, or?
Oh, thank you. I just wanted to echo one thing out that Karen had said. I think for too long we have focused on human-centered solutions, and they're the reasons why we're in this mess in the first place. I think I just want to agree with her that the approach is supposed to be a nature-centered solution. We need to see humans not being as the leaders, but as part of an ecosystem that needs to be restored.
Thank you so much. I definitely agree with this point. Nature should be our center and really our motivation for continuing fighting this climate crisis. And so, yes, thank you everyone for the wonderful speeches that you made today and the wonderful points that you brought to the floor and everything. Thank you so much. Now, if anyone else wants to add anything else, please do so. All right, so seeing that no one else really has anything else to say, I would like to, again, thank you everyone for your input today, your views. It was definitely a fruitful and effective and amazing discussion, really. And so I think we will we will end this panel here today. We would like to remind delegates that their high-level statements are due tonight at 11 p.m. GMT. So please do not forget to send in your high-level statements. And yeah, thank you so much. And we are looking forward to the caucuses happening next week and to the panel tomorrow. Thank you.
Thank you so much.
Thanks, everyone.
Thank you, everyone.
Thank you.
Can we contact each other after this panel discussion to share more insights and hopefully build more initiatives?
Yes, please connect, communicate. Thank you. All right, goodbye.